Hi there, thanks for joining me. So today I'm going to go back to the future with Microsoft Teams and Power Automate. So using the Graph API, I'm going to import historic messages from 1985 into my brand new Microsoft Teams environment. So why might you want to do that? Well, consider having a Microsoft team that you've decided to close down, but there are some historic messages on there. Or maybe you have a legacy system with some messages that you would like to import into your new team before your colleagues get started. Well, I'm going to show you how I use Power Automate and the Graph API in order to do exactly that. Let's go ahead and jump onto my demonstration. So here's my flow that I've built in Power Automate, and I will walk through this in more detail later on. But first of all, I'm going to jump onto the documentation, and it's here that I recommend you have a look and have a read. But as I mentioned earlier, we're using the Microsoft Graph API. So in order to make a connection to this API, you need to establish an app registration on Azure. And I do have another video where I show you how to create a custom connector and go through that Azure App Registration. And I'll share that link for you above now. But as you can see in the documentation, the process is relatively straightforward. First of all, you need to create a team with a back-in-time timestamp, so a historic start date. And as we're going to 1985, I make my start date back in 1985, prior to my first proposed message that I'm looking to import. Then you can go ahead and create a channel, also with a back-in-time timestamp, and then begin the process of importing external messages. Once this is all done, you can complete the team and channel migration process, and by doing that, that commits the team as things stand with those historic messages, and it takes that team out of that migration process and makes that team live. Only then can you start adding your team members and your new owners. Now, once this is done, if you've made a mistake or you realize that one of those messages were not supposed to be imported, unfortunately, it's too late. You can't go back. The only option you have is to delete that team and start again. So this documentation provides most of the examples in order to create sample messages, and those with images. It's a bit sketchy when it comes to replying to messages, but using some of the other documentation that's available, I do have that in my demonstration today, and I can walk you through that particular action. So if we just jump quickly onto my Microsoft team, you can see here I've got my Damobird 365 team open and my channel, Can We Go Back in Time? When I run this flow, it's going to create a brand new team for me, and we're going to have a DeLorean channel with some messages and some famous quotes from back in 1985. So let's go onto the flow and stick it into test mode. Now, I will walk through this flow in more detail, but it's going to run relatively quickly, and there are quite a lot of actions involved in each of these scopes that you can see here. And I've tried to group them together into different stages just so we can walk through that process once it's all complete. So this will take about a minute to complete. I have got some delays in these scopes because I did find that some of these actions would time out. So hopefully with the delays that I've put in place, everything will run end to end. And of course that end result will be that brand new team with my DeLorean channel and some back in time messages. So you can see the first scope is to authorize with the Graph API. So that's all done on Azure AD. Then we go ahead and create the team and the channel and put them into migration mode, and then grab those channel IDs. The reason we need those channel IDs is that we use them later on when we create some messages back in the future. And we also need those channel IDs when we end the migration process of both the channels and the teams. And then as you can see, the final action I have is to add a member, or in this case an owner, to the team, which means that as Damobird 365, we now have our brand new team with our DeLorean channel. So if I jump into that new channel, you can see here, was this the first ever message in Microsoft Teams? Well, for those that didn't know, Microsoft Teams was launched on the 14th of March 2017. So I'm yet to see an earlier message posted in Microsoft Teams. So maybe as Damobird 365, I was that first person to break history and post that first message. But what's this? As we work our way back through the history on our channel, we can see that Marty McFly, who's not even part of my tenant, has also posted a message back in 2015 with this famous quote, "Roads, where we're going, we don't need roads." Now, of course, I made the prediction back in October 2015 that everyone will be using Microsoft Teams. How on earth did I know that was going to happen? So as you can see, some of the other posts that I've got here from as early as 1985, we have an animated GIF, and using these actions you can post both GIFs and static images. And we will have an example of Marty McFly and Doc Brown as well. So these messages, as you can see, go all the way back to 1985, and when I built my team before posting the messages, I ensured that the kickoff date was prior to this first message, which is from the 26th of October 1985. So let's now jump back onto our flow and see how this process unfolds. So I go into the edit mode, and the first thing I'm going to explore is how to authenticate with the Graph API. So when you establish the app on Azure, you have to get your client ID, your secret ID, and your tenant ID. And then using the HTTP action, I can go through the authentication process, which is a post to this endpoint here. It involves passing the tenant ID, and then in the body, both the client ID and the secret ID. And by doing that, in return, I get my authorization or authentication string. And I have to use that later on throughout my flow as I post further HTTP actions to the Graph API endpoint. So if we just close down that Graph API scope, and we'll move into creating a team and channel in migration mode and getting the channel IDs. So just to make my life a bit easier when I was testing, I created a compose action, and in there I put the team name Back to the Future. Now for me that just meant that I could change that team name without having to go into these actions. So this is entirely optional. The first HTTP action in this particular scope is to create a team in migration mode. So all this, all the body and the various parameters I pulled from the documentation that's available from Microsoft. I'm not doing anything special at all other than following the instructions, and I would say they were detailed enough in order for me to get this particular endpoint to work correctly. The only thing that caught me out, as you can see here, we have one of our key values in our object here beginning with an @ Now, when I came to save that after doing a copy and paste, I got an error message, and it seems like you have to actually escape the @ with another @ before being allowed to save it. So whilst it's displaying fine here, if I was to go in and edit any of these various parameters, I may get an error message, and I'm giving you the hint now, you might want to try sticking an extra @ for any of these keys that begin with an @ sign. So you'll see that the display name is based on the output of the new team name above. So that determines what the team's called. And like you normally see when you create a new team, you have a description, but also we have this created date time. So I chose to go in 1984. All my messages were posted in 1985. And similarly, you would adjust that to match the history of the messages that you're looking to import. Now, some of these other parameters are all based on the type of team that I'm creating. I went ahead and created a private team, and I ensured that there was a mailbox for this team, and also I gave the mailbox a name, so the alias, and that's identical to my new team name. The next action of my flow here is to perform a split, and I'm doing that on the content location using a single quote, and the reason for that is so that I can get the team ID, which features as part of the response from the above action. So maybe when we look at the history of that, that'll make a bit more sense. But you can see at the end of the expression, I have the number 1, which means I am returning the second value or second object from that array as a result of splitting the content location. Then I go ahead and insert a delay, and that delay is of 15 seconds, and that's just based on the testing that I did. I found that if I run these HTTP posts in quick succession, I would get timeouts, and 15 seconds seemed long enough to allow as a timeout. And then once I've got my team in migration mode, I go ahead and create a channel in migration mode. So again, using the instructions that are available on the documentation, you can see that I'm passing a variable for the team ID, and that's why I had to use this compose action here and the expression to split and obtain that team ID. And here we have the name of the channel, DeLorean. And again, like before, the created date and time had to be back in the future or in the past, 1984, prior to the first message being posted. Now for the next option or next action, I used the list channels, and that was basically to list all the channels that are part of this team ID. So I've used a custom value. If I just go in there, you can see that again, I'm using that team ID as part of that action. I could of course use another Graph API call to get the list channels, but as we've already got that list channels action, this was the easier option. I then perform two separate filters on the results of the list channel. The first filter is based on the channel name equal DeLorean, and the second is based on the channel name equaling general. Now the reason I do that is that I want to then obtain the first result of both of those arrays, so I can obtain the channel ID for both the migrated messages and the channel ID. And the reason that we need both of those IDs is that we'll use them later on when we create some messages, but also when we end the migration of those channels. Now you'll see finally I have another 15-second delay, and that's because when I move on to the next scope, I've got a series of HTTP actions, and again I was finding that if I didn't create that delay, things were timing out. So let's now go and have a look at a couple examples, or maybe 5 or 6 different examples on how we created messages back in the future. So the first example of my migrating message is again using that documentation. You can see in the endpoint here I'm inserting both the team ID that we've obtained earlier and the channel ID of the migrated messages channel. And then we have our created date and time, which is all based on our times from the past, the 26th of October 1985, and we have the display name Doc Brown, and below in the body you can see the HTML, which is the message that was written to our channel. Your future hasn't been written yet. No one has your future. No one has, sorry. Your future is what you make it, so make it a good one. And you can see right at the top here we have your future hasn't written yet, etc., etc., all by Doc Brown. Now whilst I was testing this, I noticed that it was actually a time difference of 1 hour. You can see that's 1:15 in the morning, and here I've gone for midnight, 15 minutes past midnight. Now I believe that's down to being in GMT +1 because we're currently in British summertime. So bear that in mind if you're doing any manual messages and you want to get those times spot on. And this is really the most basic example, how to import a plain text message. So the next example is one importing a photograph or an image. And so like before, I have HTML, I have a series of text, but then I also using this image string, which is HTML. And you can see it's making a call to a content byte string here, which is a byte 64 encoding of an image file. So you might be thinking, oh my goodness, what on earth does that mean? Well, don't worry, because my next HTTP action is actually using an image that's already published on the web and using a URL. So it can be done a lot easier, but if you're used to getting the content of files, or you're wanting to get those images from SharePoint, for instance, it is possible for you to obtain that content of the file and post an image using this method. Again, this is all covered on the documentation above. The second option, like I mentioned, you can see here that I have a URL for a GIF, And exactly the same as before, we've got the image source and we have our URL string, which allows this particular HTTP post to post that image as an animated GIF here on the channel. So launching our back in time DeLorean to 1985 on the 26th of October. Next one is a demonstration of, what is it a demonstration of? Another message. So very much like the first one, I have another message, but in this occasion, what I'm actually trying to demonstrate is a reply to that message. So whilst this is identical to the first example that I gave you, the next one below actually uses a slightly different endpoint, and you'll see that I have the ID of the message from above. So we have the migrate message from future ID, so the body from this action above, and the ID, and the endpoint here finishes off with replies. So again, we have a reference, the reply to ID, and this is where the documentation got a bit sketchy, a bit loose, but I was able to obtain examples of how to reply to messages using some of the other documentation. And again, we insert the ID from the body of the response from the action above here. And by doing so, that means that Marty's question is replied to by myself. And not only that, you can see that I've included my display name, but also my Active Directory ID, or my GUID, that you can see there that I've obtained from my Active Directory reference. And by doing that, if we just jump back onto Teams quickly, you can see Marty McFly's question, roads, where are we going? We don't need roads. And then me, because I've included my Active Directory ID, it knows who I am, and we have my reply to Marty's message. Now, the final example we've got here is the migrate message, and it's also just a bit of history. So what I was trying to demonstrate here really was that, for those that don't know, Microsoft Teams launched on the 14th of March 2017. So my claim is this the first message that was ever posted on Microsoft Teams? Well, if I was able to time travel and I had a DeLorean, possibly so, but yeah, you're right. Today is actually the 5th of July 2021, so I'm a few years behind, but the thought was there. And that's really the end of the demonstration for the creating messages. So if we just close down that scope and move on to the final scope, this is quite a key part of the process. Now, when I was testing this earlier, I was ending the migration for the team, but forgetting to end the migration for the channel. And so I was getting a series of error messages and really struggling to find that team in Microsoft Teams. So the experience that I got was that I was able to see that team in Active Directory, and I was able to add members to that team, but as soon as I went onto Microsoft Teams, that team didn't exist. And if I tried to manually join that team, I got an error message about it being unavailable. So don't forget to end the migration of both your new channel that you've created and your general channel. And so the endpoint for that is identical. The only difference being that you have your team ID, but you must also include that channel ID. So if you remember from earlier on, we created the team and the channels, and then I performed a filter array in order to get those channel IDs. So this is where I needed those channel IDs, and it's a simple call to that endpoint, and the channel is taken out of migration mode, and those changes are made complete. Absolutely identical for the general one. And here you can see I have the reference to the channel ID for the general channel. Another delay required, because again, from experience, I found that if I ran these three in quick succession, ending the migration of the team would fail. And slightly different endpoint, we're now completing the migration of this team. So again, using our team ID from earlier, we enter it into complete migration. And now that our team's complete, it's out of migration, we need to get our first user or first owner. So again, using a custom value, using that expression from earlier, our team ID, I've gone and added my own user as a member, but then by going into the advanced options, I have ticked that I should be an owner. And that is the solution. Now, I did have a shot at this at importing messages from an existing channel, and it is possible. And you can create and apply to all loop and work your way through all the channel messages from a historic channel, and also include those replies. But I found that it was a bit temperamental when it came to the content of those channel messages. So I think it might have to potentially be a manual process just to scrape through those messages, export them first, have a look through them, and then simplify those that are no longer required. It might be possible to create a filter on those messages that you get from the Graph API and only import the basic message types. But also, if you have a look at the documentation and scroll to the bottom here, it tells you what's in scope and what's out of scope. So there are various examples of the types of messages that you can import, but also examples of messaging that you cannot import. So if you tend to have mentions or videos or stickers or quotes, these things cannot be imported historically. Now, this doesn't have to be just Teams messages. This could be messages from legacy systems, or maybe you want to have a welcome message that's posted several weeks or months before your team starts. I don't know what your scenario is, but using the examples that I've shown you, hopefully I've demonstrated what's possible. And finally, before I finish up, this is of course equally possible from PowerShell. And so if that's something you would like to see, or if you have any questions about this particular process and you would like me to go into more detail, give me a shout, leave me a message below, and make sure that you like and subscribe to my channel. Thanks very much for watching.